Outside interest groups push redistricting campaigns. Property tax changes expected to impact Indiana towns and cities. And another member of Trump's cabinet visits the Hoosier State. From the television studios at WFYI Public Media, it's Indiana Week in Review for the week ending November 14th, 2025.
Indiana Week in Review is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations.
New ad campaigns from conservative interest groups will urge Republicans to support redistricting in Indiana. As Ben Thorpe reports, the push comes as some state Republicans continue to hold out on the idea of redrawing maps.
President Donald Trump has for months been pushing states, including Indiana, to redraw congressional boundaries to favor Republicans. But Republican leadership in the state Senate has said that there aren't enough votes to support the project, even as Governor Mike Braun has called a session to redraw maps. Now, Marty Obst, chair of the group Fair Maps Indiana, says they're launching an advertising campaign to push Republicans to support redistricting.
And I will tell you that as we go along, if members continue to be hesitant or against it, that we'll have no choice but to be more forceful in that message.
Another conservative group, Club for Growth, launched a pro-redistricting campaign in Indiana, part of a seven-figure push for redistricting nationwide.
And with the push to redraw Indiana's congressional maps on, are state Republicans feeling the pressure? It's the first question for our Indiana Week in Review panel. Democrat Ann DeLaney. Republican Mike O'Brien. Laura Merrifield Wilson, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Indianapolis. And Niki Kelly, Editor-in-Chief at Indiana Capital Chronicle. I'm Jill Sheridan, Managing Editor at WFYI. So, Mike, will this pressure campaign influence lawmakers?
It's too soon to tell. But they got the right guy. I've been in the trenches with Marty Obst a lot over the years, and so they picked the right guy to do it. He knows Indiana, knows the party. So this really comes in waves, right? So the first wave is Club for Growth, run statewide ads, run these targeted ads, hit them on Twitter, see who you pick up. Because some people, for some legislators, that might be enough. So now you move your count. But then you might have to get a little more granular. Then it's going to come down to the individuals. Do you have a primary? Do you go threaten to endorse the guy running against them? Do you go recruit somebody to run against them? And if that doesn't work, do you go after, is there federal, we've seen in other states, threats on federal funding to things that they might care about. So, it layers in. So we're not really to the pressure part yet. We're kind of like to the mass media thing where it's easy to ignore the bot on Twitter that's, beating you up 1,000 times a day for some people. But then it just kind of layers in. But I think there were a couple examples this week of Jean Lysing coming out against it, senator from Southeast Indiana. Part of her reason was, I wouldn't say this if it wasn't in the release, her grandson was at basketball practice. The boys get done playing, they go back to the locker room, they've all got these text messages banging on Jean Lysing, Grandma Jean. And the boys were like, forget that. You're not beating up on Grandma Jean, right? And so and for some of these DC guys, it's like, go drive to Oldenburg, Indiana,
right,
and convince me that a Twitter campaign is going to matter, or that you can put enough pressure in a situation like that, or Eric Bassler, and who has the advantage of retiring this cycle. But he's a sophisticated guy, but a thoughtful legislator and well-educated guy. Comes out against it. Kyle Walker today came out against it, state senator from Northeast, in a tough district. And so he's like, I'm going to listen. I got to go listen to the boys at the Legion. I can't go listen to some super PAC out of Naples. So it's going to get. That's what we're going to start seeing. We're going to start seeing. We have this big mass campaign now, and we're going to see this start isolating individuals on individual circumstances and where their districts are in the state. Yeah, and for some of them, what they want to do, because there are guys who are like, look, I've had a good run. Because this isn't the most important, with the citizen legislature, this is the most important thing I'm doing every day of my life. So if the White House wants to make a run at me and make me do something I don't want to do, then that's just, I'm going home. But we're not going to know that for a minute.
We're not there yet.
Yeah, we're not there yet.
Well, we were listening to, what Jean Lysing had to say, and she did say, about her grandson, and also she said, that the ads maybe didn't even recognize that she was a female, and she said, these ads were pushing her towards more
going the other way.
Right. You know, are we going to see that some influence like that across the board?
It's not redistricting, okay? It's stealing an election. That's what this is all about. And a lot of Republicans, or the good-thinking Republicans, know it's the wrong thing to do. So they don't want to be bullied into it by Trump and his minions. So, and frankly, when you talk to voters out there, they don't want it either. And they're the ones that vote in these elections. And look what happened in states where, you know, Trump wasn't on the ballot, I'll grant you, but his programs were, and the shutdown that he initiated was, and they lost a huge number in Virginia. They lost a supermajority in Mississippi, the Supreme Court, on and on and on, people saying, we have buyer's remorse with this guy because his policies are hurting the middle class, and we don't want more of him, and we don't want him to have unfettered power. So I think you're going to have people who are going to stand up to this kind of bullying on the Republican part. You know, the maps that they drew in 2021 were perfect maps. They could not be fairer. I saw the releases, and all of a sudden now...
I recall you disagreeing with that.
Yeah, well, I do, but not for the reason that you're advancing
really
now.
like
Not for the Fair Maps Indiana group. No, it's obviously an attempt to insulate Trump against the voters because they are so unhappy with his presidency, and it's not going to succeed.
Niki, we're seeing, you know, Republicans come out and, you know, say for or against the architect of the original maps, now saying he's in support of redrawing the maps. Should we be keeping count?
We are keeping count.
What's the count?
We have a whole spreadsheet. Yeah, no, definitely by the hour. Yes, Senator Cook, I think, was a big unknown that dropped this year. He was the sponsor of the bills back in 2021. He even has a quote saying these will serve us for the next decade. He was very proud then about keeping communities of interest together. That will be hard if they go for a 9-0 map, and everyone I've talked to says if we're going for it, we're going 9-0. That's the only reason to do this. And so, yeah, we have to keep track. We're down to 19 people who have not publicly made known, at least in our tracking, and you know, we got 4 or 5 of those this week. So hopefully more and more people will start letting their stance known. The voters deserve to know it.
And Laura, you know, I've heard as well that reluctance, because what do these maps look like? What are we going to, you know, what can lawmakers expect when they head back to the State House in December?
And that was in Jean Lee Sing's press release, too. She said, I've never voted on legislation. I didn't know what was included. I hadn't read before. And that is one of the things that's kind of at risk. One of the things I think is interesting with Fair Maps Indiana and for Club for Growth is this is much more of an outsider strategy. There, of course, they'll impact, like legislators, I assume, watch TV and will see the ads, but they're really targeting constituents. They want their constituents to be upset and say, we want, in this case, both of these are supporting redistricting movements. They want constituents to put that pressure on legislators. And one thing I have to say is, though this was not in the bingo card for 2025, I do think a lot of constituents are paying attention. And a lot of the polling data suggests that people are starting to see how important this is. Very divisive issue in the state. But that outsider strategy is a really unique way to approach the situation.
Mike, do you think that more, you know, people around the state, just your everyday person, is going to really grasp onto this issue?
Well, I mean, we've been talking about it for 3 months. So, yeah, it's been on for a while. The outside campaign is really focused on Democrats did something over here. We have to do Republican things over here. Or in the state of Indiana.
Not on who started it.
That campaign, that's still a dawn of time, man. But we've never seen those types of campaigns work before, in my view, where the previous version of this was vote for the Republican congressman here to unseat Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House. Voters don't think that way, in my experience. They're looking at their guy, and they don't really care about this, you know, Game of Thrones in Washington, D.C. They want to know that they're voting for the guy here. So this, like, cause and effect argument is like, I don't really care that Republicans couldn't get it done in the Northeast or out in California. I mean, we had Democrat majorities when I started here, and we built Republican ones. Originally based on our arguments, you know. So let's go back to that model. So we'll see how the outside strategy works as an initial thing, but I think it's going to get a little more granular here.
What do you think about the messaging?
Oh, I think that it is clear bullying tactics. I mean, that's what it is. And there are enough people here who either think, they could be doing something else or aren't going to run again, or that their constituents will listen to their arguments, that they could stand up. And obviously, it's a problem for them because they started this 3 months ago and they haven't been able to call this or bring the special session to a vote. So they don't have the votes yet. And that's because there are thinking people out there who say you're opening Pandora's box if you do this. It can happen multiple times in the course of a decade, and it's not the right thing to do.
Yeah, well, we will certainly still be following this issue. Now it's time for some viewer feedback. Each week we pose an unscientific online poll question. This week's questions: should out-of-state groups influence Indiana Republicans over redistricting issues? Simple yes or no. Last week's question: should SNAP benefits be impacted during a shutdown? 9% saying yes and 91% answering no. If you would like to take part in the poll, go to WFYI.org/IWIR and look for the poll. Leaders from towns and cities across the state met in Speedway this week to draw attention to upcoming property tax changes they say will seriously impact their ability to provide services in numerous areas. Zach Castle reports.
The meeting focused on the Indiana legislature's signature bill from the 2025 session that provided property tax relief to property owners. But the taxes are one of the major sources funding local town and city governments. The officials said that the changes will cut deep into their budgets over the next couple years. Matt Greller is the CEO of Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, a group that advocates for the state's cities and towns.
So the things that citizens use every single day, they will see a reduction in. It's just a fact of the matter. Less money means less services, and that's what will happen.
The local leaders called for the Indiana General Assembly to address the issue in the next year's session.
So, Ann, our community is about to feel the impact of last year's property
tax. I think they're already feeling it. I mean, you got to hand it to the Republican majority here. When they did property tax reform, they managed to screw over the richest communities and the poorest at the same time. I mean, that takes real effort on their part. I mean, you could look at what's happening. Hamilton County's already canceled their domestic violence shelter they were going to build. There are places that are trying to buy $1 million fire engine that maybe can't do that, or maybe can't staff it if they do buy it. What the legislature did was try to make themselves look good by saying we're gonna cap property taxes. We'll have an impact on the levy is what we're going to do. Okay, fine. They didn't replace that money, and they made it more difficult for the individual communities to raise the money, and without countering it with state funds. They're still cutting the corporate income tax. They're still cutting the personal income tax. They're still giving money. Voucher money, $500 million to people who can send their kids to school without that help, private schools without that help. But we cut back on all the basics. We cut back on child care. We cut back on what communities can do in terms of fire and police protection. It's going to be a real hardship for communities, and they're going to feel it, and it's all thanks to the Indiana General Assembly's inability to govern.
Well, Mike, it did have widespread Republican support when this bill passed last year. Were these complications foreseen?
Well, usually when you're talking about cutting taxes, you're talking about giving taxpayers more money and government less money. So just as a principle, that's normally like the mission. They're going to come back and they're going to try to fill this midterm gap because a lot of the features of this bill took effect in 2025 all the way through 28 or 9 or 30, including the locals' ability to or cities' ability to levy their own local income tax and give counties their own levy, and just kind of separate those so there's a direct line from the income tax to the service. There was also an element of this from the House that there was a message sent to local government. They'll come fix some of this. But one of the messages to local government was, we've had enough of the NIMBYism. We've had enough of you responding to constituents who don't want multi-billion-dollar projects in their community that don't require you to build a new school or add a fire department, but add to your bottom line and allow you to provide all these services. We just saw a data center get killed on the south side of Indianapolis. They're putting Amazon's putting $12 billion into Cloverdale, and they're pissed about it. They're putting billions of dollars in Google Cloud and in Fort Wayne. And the locals couldn't be angrier. And I think the legislature's had enough of locals coming to the State House saying, give us more. And when the answer was, tell me about your economic development plan, and they don't, and if they have one, they're pulling back on it because the constituents don't like it. That just requires leadership and communication. They're not going to put more road money into locals if they haven't maxed out their wheel tax. You know, I think the legislature's had enough of it, and they overshot, sure, but that's just what happens when there's unreasonable decisions being made at the local level in some cases.
I mean, at the state level.
The fact is, they knew that they had made mistakes in that bill
Before.
hours after it passed, and they were already.
Why it's years in the making.
Yeah,
right?
They had already changed some things in another bill, a trailer bill. Now they know they're going to have to come back and change some other things, or maybe delay some, effective dates. Obviously, and look, the bill doesn't cut local revenue. It reduces how fast it can grow. They are still going to get more revenue than they have now, but it's not going to grow at quite the pace.
The rate they planned on.
And they want them to lean more toward income tax or wheel taxes or something like that. And cities and towns, they had not, to be fair on their side, they didn't come asking for more.
Right.
They just wanted to keep what they had. And so now we will definitely see them have to fix some things and deal with the actual impact of what that bill does. And that'll be part of the 26th session.
So with a possible property tax fix, what do you think lawmakers will be focused on?
Yeah, well, one of the things that Mike had mentioned, maybe one of the things we see Accelerate Indiana Municipalities suggest, changing that municipality versus city cap in terms of the local income tax, so that would take it from 1.2% to 1.9%. I think one of the things that's challenging is constitutionally, local governments belong. They are subservient to state government. And I think you see here a lot of the tension between who gets to make the decisions and who's left with less money, less growth, less opportunity. Of course, fewer taxes means fewer services. But you're looking at over 3 years an estimate of $1.8 billion for municipalities across the state, and that is no small number. So certainly I think the legislature will be addressing this, and there are some recommendations from the Accelerate Indiana Municipalities that seem reasonable and also very feasible to do.
It's also, part of the problem is the way Indiana is structured. If you have 3,500 different units of government dependent on these taxes, you poke it in one way, it's going to push out another. It's just not. It is not really, when you talk about governing and reducing the size and making it more accountable, that's where we ought to be starting.
I'm for that.
Are you?
Hard stop. I'm for that.
Sounds good. Around 10 members of President Trump's cabinet have made stops in Indiana this year. The most recent visit was by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in Fort Wayne this week to address defense contractors. WFYI's Eric Weddle has more.
The Northeast Indiana Defense Summit is a two-day forum in support of Indiana's role in national defense, and it's hosted by U.S. Senator Jim Banks. Hegseth delivered a speech that focused on how the Pentagon wants to streamline the way it acquires goods from the defense industry.
So the objective is quite simple: transform the entire acquisition system to operate at a wartime or warp speed footing.
Banks and event organizers use the titles of Department of War and Secretary of War to describe Hegseth's work, though no change to the name of the Department of Defense has been authorized by Congress. Outside the venue, a few dozen people protested and held up signs in opposition of Banks and the Trump administration.
So, Niki, does this seem like an increased number of high-profile stops in Indiana in any given year for a
Yeah, it definitely is.
administration?
A couple weeks ago, we had 3 cabinet members in Indiana on the same day. There was Brooke Rollins and Secretary Duffy and Kristi Noem were in on one day alone. So, yeah, we've definitely had many more of those than we have. And I think that goes to show that, Indiana's always first on the board for Trump, and Governor Mike Braun is a key ally and things like that. And these are the types of things, by the way, that I think Braun and other Republicans are concerned about if we don't do the redistricting, which isn't so much a hammer of we're going to take some program away from you, but more, you're just not going to be on our list for things like visits, or, we're not going to be the first one they think about for a program, something like that. And so I think that's an example of something that we could see go away if they don't get in line, so to speak.
Do you think, Laura, that these visits do have influence over state lawmakers?
I think they do, and I think they're also a great reflection of our state's prominence relative to the national landscape. I remember when we would talk a lot in the Midwest and say, like, oh, people think we're a flyover country, and I haven't heard that phrase used quite as much. I'm sure maybe people on the coast say that about us.
They do.
Yeah, but there is the prominence of the fact that we do matter. We are important for the president. We have a governor who aligns himself with the president right now. And I think that is to our benefit, regardless of party or ideology. We want to recognize the fact that we have a lot to offer as a state, and it's great to see the administration recognizing that too.
Mike, what do you think the marching orders sound like when they're like, off to Indiana?
Well, I agree with Niki. I think that, and I know there's a close relationship between Governor Braun and President Trump. They talk frequently. And because of that, we get more than our fair share of attention. We have a lot of requests before the federal government right now, and there is concern for good reason that if we don't, go down the path of redistricting and successfully, pull it off, that some of that's going to get pulled back. I think that concern is entirely legitimate.
Do you think these visits have any meaning?
I don't know who these people are. I don't think anybody knows who these people are. Their intelligence, their ability, their integrity doesn't have anything to do with the fact that they're cabinet secretaries. They're just loyal to Trump. That's the only requirement for being part of his administration. So, yeah, they're sending them here because you know what? They're afraid to send them some other places because he is increasingly, voters are having buyer's remorse with him, and they're afraid of demonstrations when they go someplace else. So they send them to Indiana because they'll be safe up in Northwest Indiana with Jim Banks. But I don't think it does anything for us other than convene 100 people who all want to feed at the trough as Defense Department procurers or sellers of different merchandise. So that's what that's all about. It's not about making daycare available or dealing with Medicaid or SNAP or anything that's important to Hoosiers. It's whether these guys can more easily sell the government weapons of mass destruction.
Well, we'll be excited to see who comes next to Indiana.
Right.
In his victory speech after being elected mayor of New York City recently, Zohran Mamdani quoted labor activist Eugene Debs. Born in Terre Haute in 1855, Debs was a socialist and political activist who helped found some of the nation's first industrial unions. Ben Thorpe has more.
But as Eugene Debs once said, I can see the dawn of a better day for humanity.
Allison Dirk is the director of the Debs Museum. She says she was asleep during Mamdani's speech, but woke up to her phone full of text messages. And she says it makes sense that the labor activist is having a moment.
Mass inequality, the influence of money and corporations and politics, that's not terribly new for us right now. But I also think people are ready to come together and fight back for something better.
Mamdani isn't alone in paying homage to Debs recently. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez both visited the Debs Museum in Terre Haute in October, where Sanders received an award.
So, Laura, do you think interest in this historical figure, Eugene Debs, tells us anything about today's Democratic Party?
I do, actually. The line that Mamdani used talks about dawn and a new day. I'm a morning person, so I can appreciate that. But it reminded me of Reagan's 1984 campaign, Morning Again in America. And one of the things I think is interesting is Mamdani referencing Debs, a self-proclaimed socialist Democrat, the New York City mayor-elect. That's really tricky for the Democratic Party right now. And I think you saw that dealing with the government shutdown and reopening, part of the fissure in what is always a weak coalition of individuals. That's every party by definition. It's interesting to embrace that on one hand, where you see other Democrats. I think that's a harder label to utilize. And comparing it to Ronald Reagan, who seems heralded now by conservatives within the party, even more so than he was at the time of his administration. I just find the irony of a New York City mayor evoking a Hoosier, albeit one who's very socialist, especially given the Republican stance in our state now.
Niki, do you think that, these historical, I've seen a lot of historical comparisons and just writings about, where we are today and where we were in the early 1900s.
I think Democrats are struggling, right? They're trying to figure out a way through and back into some sort of power. And you can see within the party itself concerns about some want to go more the socialist route, some don't want to. And so I think that was an interesting use of that phrase and kind of shows that Democrats are, looking at all options in terms of trying to get in charge of things again, because they're really struggling right now.
You don't have to be a socialist to understand that the people are hurting. The average age for a first-time homeowner is 40 years now. 20 years ago, it was age 28. The middle class and working class are struggling, and you don't have to be a socialist to be able to articulate that and appreciate that fact and deal with it.
Well, that's Indiana Week in Review for this week. Our panel has been Democrat Ann DeLaney, Republican Mike O'Brien, Laura Merrifield Wilson, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Indianapolis, and Niki Kelly, Editor-in-Chief at Indiana Capital Chronicle. I'm Jill Sheridan, Managing Editor at WFYI. Join us next week on Indiana Week in Review. The views expressed are solely those of the panelists.
Indiana Week in Review is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations.